So as promised, here we go with our view of Latin American history from 30,000 feet. So I'm going to try to be as broad as I can about the different topics that we're going to cover. First off, we're going to think about Indigenous America pre-1492, the time frame also known as the pre-Columbian era. You can see from this map that was included in Charles Mann's book 1491 that there was quite a bit of diversity in terms of the different groups of people that inhabited the Americas prior to European colonization. This map doesn't even capture the half of it. Within all of these different groups were many other subgroups. The Tawantinsuyu, for example, right here, we know these people as the Incas. This was the Inca Empire, its name for itself. The image that I included here is one of the bridges that dates back to Incan times, at least in terms of its design and structure. It was part of the great set of roadways that the Incas had constructed to connect the various places, communities, and cities in the Andes that were part of their vast empire. Also in South America were other groups, though, like the Tupi-Guarani people. They still inhabit the regions kind of pointed to here in what is today Brazil, Paraguay, and parts of Argentina. They're a very well-known group of people just because of the kind of area that they cover, but they were semi-nomadic. They didn't build an empire in the same way that the Tawantinsuyu, the Incas, did, or in the same way that the Aztecs did. So this line is pointing here, the Aztec Empire marked here as the Triple Alliance. That's because it was when it was an empire, it brought together the Mexica as kind of the lead group within that empire, and then a couple of other large-scale civilizations in central Mexico, including Tlatelolco, that came together politically in order to conquer other smaller groups of people, most of whom spoke Nahua. The image here is not of an Aztec site, but it's instead of an Olmec site. The Olmecs, who created these large-scale heads, they lived to the east, the northeast of the future Aztec Empire, but they're considered the mother culture of the various peoples that followed them in central Mesoamerica. Mesoamerica is the term for Mexico and the Central American isthmus kind of all taken together. I also included this picture here to help us think, along with the image of the Guarani, help us realize that indigenous people are not history. They're not just the past. You know, of course, they were the first peoples. They are referred to in many places as first peoples, or in the United States as Native Americans, or in other places in Latin America as indigenous peoples. But they were the first inhabitants of these lands. They were the first ones to kind of construct their own unique cultures. They had impacts on each other. They traded with each other. Sometimes they were at war with each other. They subjected each other to imperial rule in the case of Tawantinsuyu and the Aztec Empire that I've mentioned. And so again, the kind of main takeaway thinking about indigenous people is their great diversity across the Americas. Estimates vary, but I mean, it's very possible that according to one of those estimates, there were at least 90 million people inhabiting the Americas when Europeans arrived in the late 1400s. Also, this photograph is from 1886, after the capture of Geronimo. He's right here with his band of Chiricahua Apaches. The United States has played a role in subjugating indigenous peoples, just as the Spanish and Portuguese colonial empires and their subsequent nations played a role in either subjecting or integrating indigenous people into their societies in one way or another. And so we'll talk about that as we continue forward. Whoops, skipped ahead one. The next time frame to think about is the period of conquest. And so as you can see from the map, it wasn't just the Spanish and the Portuguese, but also the British, the Dutch, and the French, among others, who were kind of staking out on the oceans, trying to find new places, but also new ways of connecting to trade. That was the initial impetus for exploration, is trying to tap into the spice trade that had made Italian merchants very wealthy. They were trading for spices from Southeast Asia, Indonesia, through the Arabian Peninsula and the Mediterranean. So it was the Italians that kind of dominated that until maritime technology developed to the extent that Europeans could venture out into the oceans for long periods of time. Of course, Columbus discovered not a new place that wasn't inhabited, but he did discover, for Europeans at least, that there was a Western Hemisphere, that the Americas actually existed. That was unknown to Europeans prior to that. The Spanish, as they kind of ventured out and continued to explore and figure out what all was in the Americas, many of them, as you can see from this Hudson's expedition, they were looking for a way through the Americas so that they could end up over here and trade with either the Chinese or with the spice traders in Indonesia and other places in Southeast Asia. But the Spanish, though, pretty quickly after they started feeling out the territory, they kind of followed a pattern that they had followed during their own reconquest against Muslim people in the Iberian Peninsula, of conquering, of taking control of large areas of territory and groups of people. Cortés, Hernán Cortés, pictured here in one of the codices, was among the most famous of these conquistadores because he conquered the great city of Tenochtitlan, which is today's Mexico City. That was the capital of the Aztec Empire. This codex image from the codex shows Cortés speaking to Moctezuma, the last of the Aztec emperors, through his interpreter, Malinche, or Malintzin, as she was known, at least among some of her own people. And so, just to emphasize, one of the main things that aided the Spanish and the Portuguese in enacting their conquests was the use of indigenous allies. Malinche was one of these, but aside from interpreters, Cortés also was very adept at dividing and conquering. He figured out who are the people who live under Aztec rule that aren't happy about it. One of those groups was the Tlaxcalans. There were several others as well, but he was able to bring the Tlaxcalans to his side in fighting against Tenochtitlan and the Aztecs, and that was really more than anything else, except maybe the advent of disease, the thing that really enabled the Spanish conquest of these large-scale civilizations by seemingly only a few hundred men, a handful of adventurers, as is often said. If you're interested in learning more about this topic specifically, I recommend Matthew Restall's book, 7 Myths of the Spanish Conquest. He goes into a lot more detail about these things. Before we move on, I also want to mention Francisco Pizarro, who followed in Cortez's footsteps and was able to conquer Tawantinsuyu, or the Inca Empire. This image comes from an Inca chronicler after the conquest had taken place, and he shows a picture of Atahualpa, who was the last Incan emperor, meeting Pizarro and one of his priests. So this was, again, one of those big moments that was mythologized, but Pizarro was very ruthless in terms of taking control of the Inca Empire and even threatening to kill Atahualpa and many others, holding them hostage, something that Cortés did as well. So through violence and the use of indigenous allies, that was the way that the Spanish were able to take control of many of these areas. The Portuguese followed a different model. They weren't really concerned, at least initially, I should say, with taking control of territory. They instead wanted to set up trading posts. However, by the mid-1500s, wealthy Portuguese merchants were given what were called captaincies to set up little provinces here on the coast of what became Brazil. And it was kind of like giving a private enterprise, these captains, the ability to colonize on their own. Eventually, the Portuguese government kind of brought that back under their own purview as well. Whoops, there we go. It's not wanting to work. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about colonial administration pretty briefly. As you can see from these maps, there were different ways that the European powers tried to administer their American colonies. They set up what were known as viceroyalties. There were these large-scale areas. New Spain is, essentially Mexico, today's Mexico in the American Southwest. You can see the other various viceroyalties that were established. Within each of those viceroyalties, and also in Brazil, there were governorships, there were smaller scale levels of administration, and on top of all of this, there were also these things called audiencias. The audiencias were sort of like judicial bodies, but one of the things that the Spanish crown did on purpose was he gave audiencias, governors, and viceroys overlapping jurisdiction, meaning they all did the same jobs, essentially, and so no one had authority over the others. The reason for that is that they had to compete with each other for recognition from the crown in order to guarantee their authority. And that assured the crown, way over there in Madrid, across the Atlantic Ocean, at a time when communication was very slow compared to what it is today especially, it ensured the king that he could maintain authority over these vast reaches of territory and peoples from a very far away distance. It became kind of problematic later on, though, as we'll see. Also, I wanted to talk briefly about the social and racial structures of the colonial era in the Spanish Americas especially. As these cast paintings show, or casta paintings illustrate, people who could claim pure Spanish blood, such as the man depicted here, he's an Español, or a Spaniard, he would claim that they were the people who were at the top of the social hierarchy. They were the ones who had political positions. They were the ones who had the most economic power. But many of them married indigenous women. And so in this case, we see a Spanish man and an indigenous woman, and their son is a mestizo. So this says, from a Spaniard and an Indian comes a mestizo, or is produced a mestizo. These paintings over here, this series of paintings, illustrate all of the various racial combinations that could come about. And they label these things. People had status as being not just mestizo, that was usually a pretty general term, but they might be mulatto. And this was usually a Spaniard who married, this says a morra, but that would be a person of African descent, a woman of African descent. Their offspring would be mulatto. And on and on and on. And you can imagine how confusing and problematic this became. It seems very rigid and very structured. In reality, though, people could kind of overcome their caste status or their racial status by the way they behaved. If they dressed like they were a Spaniard and they had lighter skin, they were able to be merchants. They would use what they had at their disposal to kind of walk themselves up the social hierarchy ladder. So my point is, it wasn't as strict as it seems like it would have been, and people were very creative in thinking about ways they could overcome these things. Also, this is something you might want to do more research on, because I don't have time to get into it at all. People could purchase whiteness, as it was called. You could get something called the gracias al sacar, which would recognize them formally as being white, even if they weren't recognized by their peers as such. For legal status. We also need to talk about the African slave trade. Although Spaniards and Portuguese initially attempted to force indigenous people into laboring for them through structures called encomienda, which was a labor grant of indigenous labor to a certain person, through repartimiento, which was for public works mostly, just the kind of sheer workload placed on indigenous people, and also the pushback from people like Bartolomé de las Casas and other members of the Catholic Church against abuses against indigenous people, meant that African slaves were brought to do most of the hard labor in the Americas. And of course, for the slave traders, This was a very lucrative prospect. Horrific as it is, this is what happened. So from 1650 to 1860, you can see the vast numbers of people who were forcibly taken from their homes, brought across the Atlantic Ocean in a horrific middle passage, and made to perform slave labor. The vast majority ended up in the West Indies, Caribbean, and in Brazil. Only 500,000. I mean, it's still a huge number, and of course it's something that is a defining feature in very problematic ways of U.S. history. But we didn't even have that many African slaves come to the United States by comparison. It was a much stronger prospect in these other places where intense labor was required to harvest things like sugarcane, coffee. Of course, the crop in the United States in the South was cotton. And again, it's all of these very intense agricultural pursuits that kind of drove the slave trade. In Latin America, people of African descent, although they were not treated equally by any stretch of the imagination, they were, after the independence era, at least, brought into society in ways that were not quite the same as what happened in the United States. So we'll get back to that as well.